General Hospital spoilers reveal that the moment the residents of Port Charles, and viewers across the world, had long anticipated finally arrived. Drew was dead. Not missing. Not plotting in the shadows, not rebranding himself as a misunderstood antihero, but truly, undeniably gone. His body was discovered sprawled across the marble floor of Metro Court's secluded terrace. Blood trailing like a final signature, the chaos of his last moments captured in shattered wine glasses and the stunned silence of onlookers too horrified to speak. For many, it felt like justice. For others, it was the long-awaited release from the suffocating grip of a character who had manipulated, blackmailed, seduced, and betrayed with impunity. And yet, even in death, Drew managed to sow chaos. Because the question that now consumed Port Charles wasn't why he was killed, but who killed him, and why that answer might change everything they thought they knew. Drew's demise had not come swiftly, nor without signs. In the weeks leading up to his death, he had pushed every boundary of decency and legality. His alliance with powerful and dangerous players, his manipulations of Willow's maternal instincts, his calculated blackmail of Portia. His cold willingness to use Wiley as a pawn, had created a vortex of enemies too numerous to count. Yet the idea that someone had finally acted on their rage, had crossed the final line and committed murder, brought a stunning stillness to a town that had seen its share of blood. What made this moment different was not just the act, it was the identity of the killer. Speculation swept through Port Charles like wildfire. The initial suspects were predictable. Nina, whose desperation to protect her fragile relationship with Willow had pushed her to the brink. Sidwell, whose shady real estate ambitions had clashed violently with Drew's threats. Even Willow herself, traumatized, manipulated, and pushed into emotional collapse, was not beyond suspicion. But as the investigation deepened, the truth veered away from the expected. The real killer wasn't any of them. It wasn't a mob hit. It wasn't a professional job. The killer was someone much closer, someone no one had truly considered. And when their name emerged, it shook Port Charles to its core. The revelation did not come in a dramatic courtroom confession or a late-night police raid. It came quietly. Unearthed in fragments, security footage that had been partially erased, a pair of gloves found beneath a radiator, and a shattered locket that once belonged to a woman who had lost more than just faith in Drew. The killer was a person whose pain had long gone unnoticed, whose proximity to Drew made them invisible in the eyes of suspicion. And when their face was finally connected to the crime, the narrative surrounding Drew's death changed forever. The killer was someone special, not special in power, but in emotional resonance. Their identity reframed the murder not as an act of vengeance, but as a final act of liberation. The town had wanted Drew gone, yes, but they never imagined it would be this person who delivered the fatal blow. And now, that knowledge rewrote the rules of grief, justice, and memory. Suddenly, Drew's death wasn't just the end of a tyrant, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Every relationship in Port Charles began to shift. Those who had cheered Drew's downfall now found themselves uneasy, haunted by the killer's face. Jason, who had returned to the shadows in recent months, was forced into the spotlight once again, caught between duty and personal loyalty. Carly, who had been the first to discover Drew's body, was left to confront the ghosts of both her past decisions and present silences. And Willow, grappling with the trauma of Drew's actions and the shocking truth of who had stopped him, crumbled under the weight of a grief that no longer knew its shape. The police, led by a conflicted Chase and a furious Jordan, were under immense pressure. The town demanded answers, but as pieces of the crime unraveled, it became clear this was no ordinary case. Evidence had been tampered with. Witnesses were hiding more than they admitted. And beneath the surface, a new narrative began to emerge, that Drew's murder was not the work of a cold-blooded killer, but the culmination of a systemic breakdown, a delayed act of resistance, born from years of being silenced, dismissed, and disempowered. And so, the question wasn't simply who killed Drew. It became, what made this person feel they had no other choice? That question burned through every hallway in General Hospital. It infected boardrooms, bedrooms, and therapy sessions. Suddenly, the town that once celebrated Drew's downfall found itself trapped in a moral quandary. Had they collectively driven someone to kill? Had their thirst for Drew's demise blinded them to the human cost? The killer, once revealed, became a mirror, reflecting the pain that Drew had left behind, and the complicity of those who let it fester. The aftermath was unlike anything Port Charles had experienced. The killer, though arrested, refused to speak. Not a word, not a plea, just silence, an eerie contrast to Drew's own penchant for control and manipulation. That silence spoke volumes. It forced every character to confront the truths they'd buried, the secrets they protected, the damage they ignored, and the lines they'd allowed Drew to cross in the name of progress or loyalty. No one was clean. Everyone had blood on their hands. Portia, shaken by the exposure of her coerced medical deceit, nearly lost her license. Michael, guilt-ridden for not exposing Drew sooner, withdrew from public life. Nina, terrified that her own secrets might still come to light, became obsessed with controlling the narrative, even as public opinion turned sharply against her. And Sidwell, his empire crumbling under scrutiny, fled Port Charles, leaving behind a trail of burned contracts and broken promises. But amidst the destruction, something new began to form. Not hope, not yet, but truth. The murder of Drew, once seen as a dramatic end to a toxic man, had instead opened the door to raw, unfiltered reality. It forced a reckoning not just with Drew's sins, but with the ways the town had allowed him to operate unchecked. People began to speak out, nurses who'd been threatened, patients whose care had been compromised, women who'd been gaslit into silence. A portrait emerged not of a misunderstood man, but of a predator shielded by privilege, charm, and the willful blindness of those around him. And the killer? Though behind bars, they became a symbol. Not a hero, because murder is never justice, but a symptom of a deeper illness. Their story, once hidden in the shadows, was now being told in full. And that story exposed every crack in the foundation of Port Charles. In the days that followed, the town began to change. Quietly. Uneasily. But permanently. Drew's death was no longer a victory or a tragedy. It was a turning point. A moment when the entire community had to ask themselves what kind of silence they'd been living with, and whether they were willing to keep living with it. The killer's face may have been revealed, but the consequences were only beginning. As new investigations were launched and old secrets unearthed, the residents of Port Charles learned a painful lesson. Sometimes, the most devastating storm isn't the one that arrives unexpectedly, but the one you've ignored for far too long. Drew's death wasn't the end of the chaos. It was the beginning of a revolution. And Port Charles would never be the same again. The unraveling of Drew's fate was only the beginning. Beneath the surface of Port Charles, where whispers often carried more weight than headlines, a storm had been brewing, calculated, hidden, and more sinister than anyone had imagined. It was not an act of impulse or vengeance from a lone, enraged victim. It was the outcome of a dark alliance formed in the shadows by three women whose lives had been twisted and torn by Drew's manipulations: Liesel, Nina, and Portia. Together, they orchestrated a plan so deeply rooted in pain, desperation, and protective fury that when the final moment arrived, when the gun was raised and the trigger pulled, it was not chaos but clarity that echoed in the silence that followed. And it was Liesel who took the shot. What had started as scattered frustration slowly crystallized into something lethal. Liesel, having once been feared as a cold and cunning doctor, had found redemption through family, through grief, through love. But watching Nina suffer under Drew's emotional terrorism and seeing the psychological torment Willow endured, losing autonomy, losing her sense of truth, Liesel found herself slipping back into a mindset she thought she had buried. For her, justice had failed. The system that should have protected Willow was too slow, too blind, too easily manipulated by a man like Drew. So Liesel did what no one else dared. She became the executioner. But she didn't act alone. This was not the act of a rogue woman falling back into madness. This was precision. Nina, whose desperation to hold on to her daughter had led her to countless compromises, finally crossed the line into something irreversible. And Portia, whose career and integrity had been shredded by Drew's blackmail, had everything to lose, and everything to gain from his silence. The three women, driven by different motives but bound by a shared enemy, formed a pact sealed in secrecy and fury. The plan unfolded with meticulous timing. They studied Drew's habits, isolated his vulnerabilities, and calculated when and where his guard would be down. It was Nina who lured him to the rooftop of the Metro Court. Under the guise of one final conversation, a last-ditch effort to mend what he had broken with Willow, Portia ensured that security systems were rerouted, cameras blinked into static, and the emergency stairwell access was unlocked and clear. And Liesl, dressed in black, emerged from the shadows as the city lights blinked below and silence filled the space between final words. There were no warnings. No dramatic confessions. Just one shot, delivered with the cold precision of a woman who had once taken lives in the name of science, now doing so in the name of justice. Drew's body fell to the rooftop tiles, eyes wide not in fear, but disbelief. He hadn't seen it coming. He never believed anyone could reach him. He was wrong. But what they hadn't accounted for was what came next. News of Drew's death shattered the surface of Port Charles like a stone through glass. The town that had silently wished him gone suddenly found itself drowning in questions. Who would dare execute such a public murder? How did it happen without a trace? Why was there no footage? No witness, no forensic trail? The police scrambled. Jason was pulled back into the storm. Carly couldn't process the loss, torn between relief and rage. Michael's reaction was ice-cold silence. He had lost too much to feel anything at all. But the truth, buried deep beneath layers of lies and manipulation, didn't stay hidden for long. The alliance between Liesl, Nina, and Portia began to crack. Liesl, ever the surgeon, was methodical, but not invincible. Guilt does not bleed, but it festers. Nina grew paranoid. She feared not exposure, but the consequences of her choice. Portia, whose medical career was now forever stained, found herself buckling under the weight of secrets. They hadn't anticipated that killing Drew would only open the door to greater darkness. And that's when the new terror began. Someone had been watching. Not a cop. Not a rival. Someone else entirely. Someone who knew what they had done, and someone who wanted to make them pay. A series of anonymous threats began to appear. A bloody glove left in Nina's office drawer. A syringe delivered to Portia's home with a note reading, "You silence others. Now it's your turn." Liesl received an unmarked envelope with a photograph of Drew's body taken moments after the killing, an angle she hadn't seen, meaning someone else had been there. The killer had become the hunted. The three women met in secret, their alliance now poisoned by fear. Trust began to evaporate. Were they being followed? Had one of them talked? Did one of them regret it enough to betray the others? Every interaction was laced with suspicion. Portia feared for Trina's safety. Nina refused to let Willow out of her sight. Liesl began carrying a concealed weapon, again. Meanwhile, the town teetered on the brink. Sonny sensed something was off but couldn't prove it. Jason began to suspect that Drew's death wasn't just an act of revenge but a coordinated execution. Willow, devastated and confused, felt guilt creeping into her grief. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had killed for her. And Carly, digging through Drew's final calls and texts, stumbled onto a deleted voicemail, Nina's voice, saying, "You brought this on yourself." As the noose tightened and the walls began to close in, one thing became clear. Killing Drew hadn't ended the story. It had started a new one. One laced with paranoia, betrayal, and the possibility that someone else, someone even more dangerous, had now entered the game. Liesl had pulled the trigger. But now she, Nina, and Portia were targets. Not of justice. Not of the law. But of something darker. Something vengeful. Something that doesn't just want the truth, it wants retribution. And in Port Charles, no secret stays buried forever. The end of Drew's story in General Hospital was never going to be quiet. From the moment he returned to Port Charles, cloaked in reinvention and control, his presence triggered a chain reaction of mistrust, betrayal, and emotional devastation. But no one expected his demise to come with such brutal finality, or for the fallout to stretch so far beyond the body left behind. When Drew was found dead, everything changed. Not only was a manipulative force finally silenced, but the trauma he left behind began to surface in those he claimed to care about most. And now, as the dust settles, it's clear that Drew's death isn't the end of the pain. It's only the beginning of a deeper unraveling, one that pulls Willow, Jason, and Michael into a storm from which they may never recover. It started subtly. A news alert. A phone call. A single, jarring sentence, Drew is dead. But for Willow, it wasn't grief that hit first. It was confusion. For so long, Drew had been the architect of her unease, the man who had played puppeteer with her emotions, using Michael and Wiley as leverage in a cruel campaign of control. His final months were marked not by redemption, but by obsession, his need to dominate the narrative, to control every truth, to reshape Willow's life until it belonged to him. And yet, when he died, something inside her cracked. Not because she missed him, but because part of her felt complicit. Because part of her wanted it. Now that he was gone, Willow should have felt free. Instead, she spiraled. Every corner of Port Charles reminded her of the emotional prison he'd built around her. Every well-meaning question about how she was coping forced her deeper into isolation. She began to wonder if anyone truly understood the grip he had on her. How even in death, he haunted her with silence, with the echoes of decisions he'd forced her to make. Drew had promised her protection, promised her peace, but what he left behind was a shattered mirror she couldn't look away from. Her sense of self fractured, her relationship strained, and her trust in her own judgment completely gone. Michael, meanwhile, was trapped in a war between relief and rage. He had watched Drew manipulate his family, poison his relationships, and twist the truth into a weapon. And now, with Drew dead, Michael should have felt victorious. But instead, he found himself drowning in questions. Who did it? Was it someone acting for justice? Or was it a new enemy rising in Drew's place? Worse, Michael couldn't ignore the lingering doubt that perhaps he should have stopped Drew sooner. Perhaps, by allowing Drew to go unchecked, he had become part of the rot. The guilt bled into his marriage, into his fatherhood. He began keeping secrets from Willow, not to protect her, but because he no longer knew how to speak the truth. And then there was Jason. Jason returned to town already carrying the weight of years lost, relationships frayed, and a reputation always on the edge of shadow. But Drew's death reopened wounds Jason thought he had buried. The two shared more than a face, they shared history, guilt, and the eternal burden of being forced into roles they never asked for. With Drew gone, Jason should have felt a strange peace. But instead, he was called back into chaos. Questions about the murder pulled him into investigations he didn't want. Carly leaned on him more. The Quartermaines expected him to pick up the pieces. And worst of all, he began to wonder whether he'd truly escaped Drew's influence, or whether he had inherited it. The town, too, changed. People spoke Drew's name with unease. Some praised the end of a manipulator. Others whispered about vengeance, justice, and the possibility of a larger conspiracy. The circumstances surrounding his death remained murky. Some said it was an act of retribution, others hinted at a professional hit, and a few believed it was staged. Theories ran wild. And as more secrets from Drew's final weeks came to light, his final meetings, his threats, his failed blackmail attempts, it became clear that his death had ignited a deeper rot. Port Charles was now a town with a wound that wouldn't close. And Willow, Michael, and Jason were at its center. Willow's health began to falter, not physically, but emotionally. She lost interest in Wiley's milestones, avoided eye contact with Michael, and woke in the night screaming. She started journaling again, pages filled with Drew's name, sometimes with hatred, sometimes with confusion, and sometimes with guilt. She questioned her own morality, her silence, and whether her wishes had somehow made the murder possible. Her breakdown was slow, quiet, and deeply private. But it was real. And it was devastating. Michael, facing mounting pressure at ELQ and from within his own household, became increasingly paranoid. Every whisper, every glance felt like a threat. He began pulling away from Willow, not out of lack of love, but out of fear that if he confessed his own role in covering up some of Drew's misdeeds, he might lose her for good. And in doing so, he began repeating the very patterns that Drew had once used against them: lies, manipulation, and control. Jason, haunted by unfinished conversations and the final voicemail Drew left him, never heard, never deleted, found himself standing at the edge of a moral chasm. He knew how Port Charles worked. He knew people killed when pushed too far. But he also knew Drew had pushed many too far. And now, as the police started asking questions and suspects surfaced, Liesl, Portia, even Sonny, Jason was being drawn back into a world he thought he'd left behind. Not as a hitman, but as the only man left who might be able to uncover the truth. The truth that Drew was not simply murdered. He was erased. Because someone had planned it, executed it, and ensured that no trace of their motive remained. And the more Jason investigated, the more he feared that the killer wasn't a stranger. It was someone close. Someone broken. Someone who had finally decided that the only way to heal was to destroy. As Willow, Jason, and Michael navigate this twisted aftermath, they begin to lose pieces of themselves. Trust crumbles. Relationships fracture. And grief becomes a language they all speak, but none understand. Drew may be dead, but the shadows he cast remain long, and now, they threaten to swallow the very people who survived him. This isn't closure. This is a new beginning. A darker one. A haunted one. And Port Charles will never be the same. The investigation into Drew's death began as a routine case of homicide in Port Charles, but quickly spiraled into a far more insidious and far-reaching crisis as the PCPD uncovered layer after layer of darkness that Drew had buried beneath the surface of his public persona. What initially looked like a personal attack, a revenge killing brought on by emotional betrayal or one of Drew's many manipulations, soon revealed itself to be the unraveling of a man whose very existence had become a threat to nearly everyone around him. Drew had always operated on the edge of morality. But in the final weeks of his life, he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and his murder may have simply been the inevitable consequence of a man who built his power on fear, control, and secrets no one was ever meant to discover. As the PCPD launched its formal investigation, Commissioner Jordan Ashford and Detective Harrison Chase found themselves not just trying to solve a crime, but forced into unraveling an intricate tapestry of blackmail, surveillance, and emotional terrorism that Drew had constructed behind closed doors. His laptop, recovered from his office, became a digital vault of destruction, a trove of hidden folders protected by advanced encryption, each filled with information so sensitive it could ruin lives in an instant. Names, files, photographs, audio recordings, private emails, falsified medical records, and financial documents tied to hidden accounts were all logged with chilling precision. Catalogued not as souvenirs but as weapons. Drew had not merely collected these things for leverage, he had used them repeatedly to bend people to his will, and now that he was gone, the full weight of his manipulations was crashing down on those left behind. Willow, who should have felt liberated by Drew's death, instead began to suffer an emotional and psychological collapse as the full scale of his interference in her life became impossible to ignore. The forged psychiatric evaluations Drew had prepared to challenge her parenting, the secretly recorded conversations used to undermine her confidence in Michael, and the manipulated records of her transplant recovery all pointed to a disturbing pattern. Drew had planned to isolate her completely, to create a narrative where she would be seen as unstable, incapable, and in need of his protection. The knowledge of how close she had come to losing everything, her child, her autonomy, her identity, was more than she could process. She began having nightmares, hearing Drew's voice in her head, questioning her own sanity. Every smile from a stranger, every glance from a nurse. Every supportive word from Michael now felt like pity wrapped around a secret she didn't understand. And though she tried to bury it, part of her kept asking the question she feared most. Had she wished for Drew to die? Had she, in her silence, helped manifest the very horror that now haunted her? Michael, too, found himself drowning in doubt and dread. Drew had been more than an enemy, he had been a shadow inside Michael's own house, a specter poisoning every conversation, every moment of peace with Willow and Wiley. Michael had suspected something dark in Drew's motives, but even he hadn't known the extent of the damage until the files surfaced. Drew had attempted to reroute ELQ shares, forge signatures, and manipulate stock prices to force Michael into surrendering control. These weren't just business tactics, they were sabotage with the intention of reducing Michael to a puppet, dependent on Drew for both power and family stability. Now, with Drew dead, Michael had to live with the knowledge that he hadn't stopped him. He had let it fester. He had protected Willow by staying silent, and in doing so, he had failed her. He stopped sleeping, started locking doors twice, and began working obsessively to uncover every file, every trace. As if understanding the full extent of Drew's reach would somehow absolve him of guilt. But nothing helped. Because the more he uncovered, the more he realized that Drew had prepared for his own downfall. Drew had expected to be caught, and he had left traps in place, digital trails that implicated others. Backups of backups designed to activate if anything ever happened to him, and a posthumous plan meant to drag down as many people as possible with him into the grave. Jason, long thought to be free of Drew's shadow, was pulled back in by the sheer weight of obligation and truth. While he and Drew had never been close in the traditional sense, their shared identity, once tied by blood, now bound by consequence, meant that Jason could not walk away. Carly leaned on him, the Quartermaines called for him. And even the PCPD turned to him as the only person with enough of a connection to Drew to possibly understand what he had done and why. As Jason dug through Drew's contacts and timelines, he discovered references to meetings with unknown parties, encrypted texts with phrases like containment breach and family pressure, and logs of late-night calls made to a disposable number that traced back to the outskirts of town. Something larger had been unfolding in Drew's world. Something that involved more than Port Charles, something that hinted at a secret network of influence and control. And the more Jason unearthed, the more he realized that Drew had not just been dangerous, he had been preparing for war. The PCPD investigation expanded accordingly. The initial case of murder now included tampering with hospital records, financial fraud, cybercrime, and possibly even conspiracy involving parties outside the jurisdiction of Port Charles. Chase discovered that Drew had bribed technicians to install unregistered listening devices in General Hospital. Jordan received confirmation that at least 3 high-profile Port Charles citizens had received anonymous blackmail threats in the months leading up to Drew's death, messages that only Drew could have sent, unless someone else had access to his files. And then came the biggest shock, a voice message, recovered from Drew's backup server, recorded just hours before his murder. It was cryptic, fragmented, but unmistakably a warning: they know what I've done. I went too far. If this message is playing, it means someone finally had enough. That message wasn't meant to protect him. It was a confession wrapped in fear. As Port Charles begins to understand the magnitude of Drew's crimes and the true purpose of his death, the mood in the town shifts from grief to dread. People begin to look over their shoulders, to wonder who else knew, who else helped, and who else might be next. Liesel, Nina, and Portia, each tied to Drew's final days in different, complicated ways, find themselves pulled deeper into suspicion, not because of what they did, but because of what they didn't stop. Carly can't sleep. Jason can't rest. Michael can't forgive himself. And Willow, perhaps more broken than anyone, begins to retreat from the world entirely, as if she fears that the more she remembers, the more she might find herself to blame. Drew's death was not the end of his story, it was the explosive beginning of a new crisis in Port Charles, one built on the ruins of trust, the erosion of identity, and the devastating realization that no one truly knew how far he had gone until it was far too late. The PCPD will continue to investigate. Files will continue to surface. But some stains, once exposed, cannot be washed away. And for Willow, Michael, and Jason, the scars Drew left behind may never fully heal. Because the real horror wasn't just that Drew died. It was that he had become a monster in life, and in death, he continues to unravel everything he once pretended to protect.